This is Culford School in Suffolk, where I taught English for most of my career before I retired to enjoy my interest of writing about composers and their music. While biographies tell us much, it is in a novel that we are able to personalise an artist and portray their spirit vividly through imagination. It will, of course, be only one perspective on a life, but if perceptively researched can bring back that spirit for a new generation. After 40 years studying Delius and appreciating his work, it seems to me that his compositions are even more fascinating now than when they were written over a century ago. Perhaps it was that at its heart lie three of his obsessions. One was his love of the natural scene, the wild mountains of Norway, the rivers of France and America, and barren moors of his native Yorkshire. Another enthusiasm is his hedonistic attraction to Parisian entertainment and the vitality of social gatherings that is expressed in the spirit of the dance. But most importantly for us is the confidence he expresses in man's individual will to forge his own destiny. Today, debates highlight risks of a diminishing nature, reduced social experiences and difficulty with self-image in so-called culture wars. Perhaps through Delius's life and music, with its life-affirming spirit and enlightened belief in driving one's own destiny, we can find some answers. In writing my novel Sea Drift, this is the aspect I have found most significant of all.
It is 1934. In his last weeks, Delius is bedridden at his house in the French countryside at Grez-sur-Loing. One of the brooders who is there to lift and carry him wakes him up.
So that trespasser's got into the garden again, causing trouble. This time, you say, he's kicked over a planter and broken down the hollyhocks.
This bright news of an intruder proves so welcome that Delius chuckled at his plight. For long blind, one of his only joys was that intimate capacity of the artist to live through the eyes of others.
That boy, who is he? He's destroying things because I'm helpless. And he realizes there's no way I can stop him. I can feel a sense of adventure because at his age I would have done the same things. Always exploring, always wanting those things that others wouldn't dare.
The composer hears a dog barking monotonously. It is a hot day, this July in 1934, and in spite of his pain, all he can think of now is how the yellow-starred, poppy-streamed countryside is flouncing down into the narrow paths and gardens to make riot in the village. You've written a novel, Sea Drift, which is a life of Frederick Delius, told through the medium of fiction. Can you tell us what was it that drew you to Frederick Delius and made you want to write about him?
Well, actually, I thought about him and heard his music when I was quite young, I think when I was about 14 or 15, and I realised straight away there was something unusual about the sound of this music. It's very lyrical, but I thought there's a lot behind this music. It was so atmospheric and had a profundity to it, I would say, and that made me very interested in the man, particularly when I heard, I suppose like a lot of people did, that he was trapped in his house in France and was handicapped and blind and so on, was being looked after by his wife in his final days. It's a kind of romantic, Byronic type of story in a way. So I retained my interest, and when I started collecting records, he was quite high in my list, particularly in the 60s. In the 60s and 70s, there was a big interest in Delius, as if he was almost newly discovered. So gradually I built up the material to make this book. It took me a long time because I was teaching, you see, so I could only write in the holidays, and I had to keep rewriting it to get it right. But eventually, when I reached retirement at 60, that's what I did. I rewrote the whole thing and found I had the time to sort of perfect it, shall we say. And it did end up as a book that I wanted to write about not just his music, but the way in which his character fed into his music. And he had a very distinctive character. He was very much an individualist, and that interested me too, because that's how I see the artist, as a kind of rather isolated figure who never goes with the crowd. The artist thinks things and feels things for himself and has this drive to communicate with other people, this vision or kind of revelation that you have of somebody. As you know, you actually helped me manage publishing of the book and so on, and apparently it has created some interest, so I have filled a gap, because I don't think anything actually fictional, in terms of a novel anyway, has ever been produced about Delius. And it was such an exciting story, I really couldn't help but write it. But also, I do closely research it. A lot of it, everything in my research comes from people like Lionel Carley, who was probably the greatest scholar on Delius, and Robert Threlfall, who was there in the 50s and 60s. They did the major research that's ever been done on Delius. There were early books, of course, like this one. It was the first kind of work written by his sister, you know, about his childhood, which is very interesting to read, but far too much you feel that she's left out or didn't know. So it gives you a flavour of things. It's from Claire Delius's account I have based this next chapter of the book about Fritz's childhood. This is set in Scarborough when he was a boy and used to holiday there with his family.
On the cliffs above the bay at Scarborough, Fritz, the boy, is waving to his sister Claire, who joins him. The rest of the family, strolling through the long grass in the rising fields, call them away to tea at the hotel.
The others missed it, but I saw the horses on the seashore.
Fritz, with his attention on the sky, remains unmoved.
It's late. Perhaps we should follow the others back for supper.
Fritz hands her the telescope. She screws her eye to it, but as she makes out not much more than a fuzzy circle, she gives it back.
What? Oh yes, a nest in a cliff. Is it empty?
There must be young ones there, but for the moment she's flown off.
On one knee, Fritz gazes into the sky across the edge of Caton Bay, then turns the telescope to a spot in the fields below where the birds had settled.
Claire is trying to find the interest I do, and so laughs at the intricate tumbling of creatures in the sky as they make sharp cries. I smile briefly, but know I am playing an idle game with her.
Fritz doesn't say anything, but I feel at one with him because of the birds' high calls and their darting movements against the accompaniment of sea and sky.
In the fields below, the children run amok, and the bright bands of their hats make a dance of their own as they dip to catch the sun. Soon they are hurled into the air with accompanying shrieks.
Regardless, with my mind elsewhere, I shade my eyes and stare out to sea. So I can't claim to be a great scholar. You know, I haven't done this wonderful work that Lionel Carley did, and Threlfall and others who have followed him. But I feel it's been worthwhile because now novels are being respected a little more for their serious intent than they used to be. People used to think of novels as kind of fanciful inventions. But I think it's since the writing of history, Hilary Mantel particularly, who actually managed to bring things so vividly to life, to Thomas Cromwell and the complexity of his character, etc. And I feel there's room to do it also for artists. Well, it has been done for artists before, but I'm doing it for a particular composer. And I think it does bring life into it, and it does help people to understand more readily than perhaps scholars can always convey, because they have to be technical and they have to be exact and they have to be detailed. In a sense, you get perhaps a profounder insight into character, although, of course, you're risking the fact that the audience may not agree with you, and you have to accept that.
So could you tell us a little bit more about Fritz's life before he left to go to America?
Yes, he was very ordinary, really, as a boy. I mean, he had the advantages of sort of prosperous middle-class parents that set him on his path. His father was slightly musical, but I don't think played any instrument particularly. And of course, in those days, as most people know, middle-class parents were against their children taking up careers in the arts because it wasn't quite respectable. And so his father did not mind him having music as a hobby, as an amateur, and he had violin lessons in Manchester. So he had quite a good early musical training, but he certainly did have a real talent. There's no question about that. I mean, you read about the fact that he used to be able to make things up, tunes up and so on, and he enjoyed that most of all when he was playing. That brings us to the next chapter, which is set at the family house from Bradford. And here we see the Delius family at a home concert with their Uncle Theo and Julius, their father.
Of German origin and now prosperous in the wool business, the Delius family of 12 children live in a fashionable district of Bradford. Originally christened as Fritz, the boy who will one day become Frederick Delius performs on the violin.
My brother Max, the youngest and possibly the quietest of the three sons, is listening to our family concert. He sits sullenly by the curtains, a handsome lad, slimmer than his two brothers, Ernst and myself.
Fritz's violin playing fills the room with enchanting harmonies, magicked up from his own improvisations of modal folk tunes, as he objected to showing off with the classics of Haydn or Brahms, as approved by his austere businessman father, Julius.
Max glances nervously from left to right. As he lacks talent, this music must be like an effete grasping at light and shadows, butterflies fluttering to no purpose.
Claire, the closest of his brightly smiling sisters, commends the younger children for their efforts at song and keyboard plunking. Behind the back of his stern father Julius, Uncle Theo, his enlightened relative from Paris, applauds loudly. Then, much to Julius's disapproval, Uncle Theo makes faces at the younger children before taking a pinch of snuff to make them titter. "It's odd how these youngsters seem to evade your formality, Julius. Why don't you appreciate their individual enterprise and invention? Give the boy some room. He shows talent."
Max props himself against the corner of the room, his head lowered sulkily. The younger children eagerly gather round me while I check and tune their instruments.
Claire has a rest in her piano part.
He's cruel to remain entirely himself, but Fritz is still an angel. One of the wicked ones who someone forgot to push out of heaven.
He didn't like playing, apparently, Beethoven and Brahms, or the traditional accepted composers of that time. I suppose it was because it was too much what his father liked, I suspect, because he had this tension with his father that's also fairly well known. And so he went to the Bradford Grammar School, which would have been sort of standard in that area at that time. And then his father tried to train him for business, so he went to the business college in Isleworth, actually a college which I knew when I was young, still standing in its original state. But then, in the business, his father wanted him to travel round, so he went to places like Stroud in England and also went to France. There were towns in France that were associated with the wool industry, which his father, he was a wool merchant, you see, so he was learning the trade, and he went into Germany to Chemnitz, where he picked up a violin teacher, Hans Sitt, who was very well known, and it was later to find that when he went to Leipzig, to the conservatorium, Hans Sitt was there teaching, so he was a pupil twice over, different stages in his career. But of course, as we all know, he couldn't stand the business, so decided to break away and do his own thing, whether his father liked it or not. There's no doubt he was just keen to get away from home in the end, because he had this natural urge to be himself. He had a very strong streak of individuality, you know, and a very, very strong character. But he still relied on his father for finance, and he must have been quite persistent for a strong-minded man like Julius to have actually given way to him. But in the end, Delius got the idea of going to America and starting a career there, not altogether honestly, because he told his father he wanted to be an orange planter, you know, have an orange grove. And I suspect that was just an excuse to get away.
And so, at 22 years old, Delius decides to go to America with his friend Charles Douglas to start an orange grove.
Aged 22, with a businessman colleague, Charles Douglas, I leave to take over an orange grove in Florida. Dependent on Julius's allowance, my real motives, though, are to escape, to find personal freedom and the chance to work out my musical destiny.
Once there, he quickly falls in with Johnson, the African-American overseer of Solana Grove. On their arrival, they find the place neglected and overgrown.
I have a plan, Johnson, that won't include my business partner, Charles Douglas. It will take time to sort out the grove, but as soon as we're settled, I want you to take me out in the skiff on the river to show me the glades.
That's right, sir. You want to know and understand. That's what the outlanders won't never do. I can show you the secrets of springtime and summer here, things that you won't never forget.
In the overnight stories, I heard that the forest and river was peopled with every sort of fantasy, the fruit of superstition, tradition, communal wisdom.
You can't explore glade and its runs on your own, Mr. Delius.
My girl Chloe is a wonder and a mystery. But she's right, Mr. Delius. To go so deep into the forest would be dangerous without a guide.
I'll go back and tell Douglas to carry on clearing the grove, and you can take me out into the glades as soon as possible.
Johnson has to pick up his brother and nephew, and on the edge of sunset, they set off in the skiff on the alligator hunt which the foreman had promised him. Listen, sir, to those a-singing on the riverboats far away across the water. There ain't no sadness like that. It reminds us we're the children of an enslaved people, and that's as true yesterday and today as the world's swinging into the dark. So how did America influence Delius and his music?
Yes, that's a fascinating question. One wonders what Delius would have done if he hadn't have gone to America, if he'd have just been a pupil or student of the European tradition in music, which was all German, of course, though the French were beginning to make their mark. Certainly he didn't want to be a composer like Schumann or Brahms, that's definite. So in a way, his trip to America wasn't just a need to get away from his father and discover freedom for himself. It was also a chance to hear a different kind of music. America was just listening to the same music that we were at that time, German music, essentially. But of course, there were the Afro-Americans, and he heard their music, and there's no question that he was very influenced by their more relaxed, spontaneous type of utterance that was much more deeply felt than the sort of academic music, classical music of Europe.
So it made a big difference that he was in Florida and not in another part of the United States.
Yes, I think it did, yes. And I think he discovered something that he could take from them. He wanted to write, definitely wanted to write lyrically, and all plantation songs and the spirituals were of a profound kind, weren't they? And yet they expressed themselves very harmoniously. And I think he picked up this idea of style from them, really. They were very relaxed about their singing, yet it was very intense. And certainly that influenced him. But also, I think he got this idea you can take influences from everywhere. Because he travelled a great deal in Europe already, and he had this sort of wandering instinct as part of his character, really. He liked that idea of picking up ideas here and there from different kinds of... I mean, there's a French influence in his music, what we might call generally impressionist sort of influence that was operating in French music, that certainly didn't have the same structural formality of German music, and he liked that idea too. The idea of his personality comes in the rhapsodic nature, which is once again true, of course, of Afro-American music. I mean, it gave rise to jazz, you know, to some extent, and he didn't go that far, of course, at that time, but he did like the looseness and the way they just invented as they went along almost, you know, they could do that.
And in addition to the Afro-American influences, Delius's time in Florida also introduces him to another figure instrumental in his development. This meeting happens by chance when later Charles Douglas is ill, so that Delius is forced to go to the nearest town, Jacksonville, for a doctor.
Tempted into a music shop, I meet Thomas Ward, an organist from New York, who is interested in my composing ambitions. I've listened to the forests and the river and learned from the Negroes here. Now I'd like to show you the way I'm trying to express it. Perhaps you could help me.
You must be a renegade to struggle as a composer when you could so easily work for your father.
But Florida has woken me up. If I wasn't so damn restless, I could spend my life here trying to express fully in sound what its richness of place and people mean to me.
I've come from Brooklyn to recuperate from consumption and only know what the Jesuits and the ghost of J.S. Bach, above all, have taught me on the organ. You're wise to listen to the field workers. Apart from their kind of crooning, there's no new music in the States. Everyone's too busy making money and building everything up for the future.
Well, you might help me then. You see, up till now, I've scarcely learnt more than the basics of music. Show me how counterpoint works. So far, it's just been attempts at salon music, improvisation, and a few fiddle lessons as a way of entertaining myself around Europe. So he came back to Europe and managed to get his father to fund him through the Leipzig Conservatorium. He was there, I think, 2 years, and there he had his formal teaching, which he disliked intensely. But what he really liked was his meeting with Grez. His meeting with Grez was very, very fruitful, because Grez seemed to understand Delius, what Delius was after, because Grez was trying to escape from the German tradition as well. I mean, this was the age of the nationalist composers, you know, like people like, the obvious ones, Dvorak, you know, Smetana, and those kind of Eastern European composers. But Norway was certainly in the lead with Grez, you know.
So do you think that they felt a bit of an affinity because they were both men from countries that weren't at the centre of European music at the time?
Yes, I think that's true. Yes, and I think they were grateful not to be at the centre because it enabled them to be different. I mean, it is possible to argue that in some ways French music in the last half of the 19th century, the latter half of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, to some extent overtook German music for a time with composers like Debussy and Ravel. They were definitely trying to escape, and they were inventing, in a way, a new kind of music. Largely, of course, from the influence of Wagner, who loosened up German music, there's no question, in his music dramas, and was doing exciting new things which interested all the composers around at that time.
And it is during his time studying that this next chapter is set as Delius meets another early influence.
2 years later, and my frustrated father, Julius, disappointed with my failure in business, reluctantly agrees with my wish to attend the Leipzig Conservatorium. My companion is Christian Sinding, a fellow student and composer. We are on our way to our midday meal at the Panorama restaurant, when my fellow student indicates a couple coming towards us.
There's Mr. and Mrs. Grieg.
I bow to Nina Grieg and, playing the doorman, wave them into the restaurant. I've discovered Norwegians think deeply. Norway might be a barren place, but the country people are its charm and complement the soul of its landscape.
Nina taps Fritz's arm.
Why try to express the inexpressible? Words don't work so well. Save your sentiment for your music. I'm sure Edward agrees.
Yes, Sinding here has been bold enough to show me some of your work. It has possibilities. Unlike so many young composers, it's more than inflated parlor music or fake Brahms. You understand the role of landscape and folk music influences. I admire your progress.
You should hear what the Africans have done to music in America. It's unique. I'm trying to rework some of its feeling into a Florida suite. The rhythms are slow, entrancing, and the harmonies deeper and heartfelt.
You've written about Delius's arrival in Paris. Could you tell us something about who were the influential friends that he made?
Yes, well, probably the most important would be Gauguin, in a way. He met Gauguin through another composer, William Moller. He was really only an amateur composer who used to have a kind of soirees in which other artists would arrive, a lot of Scandinavian artists as well as French artists. It was quite cosmopolitan. They would chat about art and what they were doing, one thing and another. It was there that it so happened that Gauguin lived in the same studios, or came to live in the same studios. And so artists would arrive, friends of who courted him, shall we say, came along and wanted to show him their pictures, and he would discuss his art with them. But the best thing he liked talking about was himself, his own life. That's what interested him, because he regarded himself as somehow an avant-garde painter, as doing something different from every other painter in France at that time.
Do you think there was something that they had in common? Because Gauguin was inspired by a distant land. He was inspired by Tahiti.
Yeah, you're right.
And Delius had been inspired by his time in Florida. So do you think that was something that...
Yeah, that's true. And they were both escaping from their families. That's another interesting aspect. It was his time away in Tahiti and also in the Americas. He was there for a time as well. That Gauguin discovered his true gifts in describing, painting native life, Aborigine life, the life of the Polynesians, when it comes to Tahiti. He could describe, somehow, get right below the surface of what most people would recognize about these original people. He was interested in their religion and in their superstitions and in their whole way of life that was so different from that of the West. And in a way, he is the artist who, above all artists, captures the passing away of a culture, a fragile culture, because of course it's being overtaken by the development of Europe.
As well as meeting Gauguin and other artists, Delius gained inspiration to exploring Paris, as this next chapter, set while living with his uncle Theodore, illustrates.
After his experience in Germany, Delius at last determines to settle in Paris, where he hopes to find the necessary sort of freedom and companionship.
Uncle Theodore is a splendid fellow, wrote Delius a few months later to Grieg. Here in Paris, I am in a vacuum. It seems as though I've become a new life. There are no associations with anything else that has ever been, so I am like a child, innocent in wonder at everything. For the moment, of course, I cannot work, Uncle Theo is too much the host and constantly entertains. His guests are mostly distinguished citizens full of authority and wit, no doubt, but all are too busy to give much time to me.
Another day, and farther south, at the extremity of the Ile de la Cité, Delius reaches the target of his fascination. He mingles with knots of curious tourists outside the morgue.
Once inside the courtyard, I see workers from neighbouring factories who make a practice of eating their lunch in that morbid place. Such a weird tumult. Caught in the press they make, I move forward through the building into the dark interior of what should have been a forbidden zone. A glass partition separates the close shuffling crowd of spectators with greedy eyes and wide grins, watching the vastness of a still blue chamber where the dead lie. The shop and factory girls giggle and whisper infectiously to the labourers in their fear and fascination. What was this dark experience? For those watchers, it magnified the thrill of being alive. But for me, it was the challenge to capture the essence of life and make it live forever in art.
How about composers? What composers did Delius build relationships with?
Ravel. Well, when Ravel was quite young, in fact, Ravel took some of his scores and made piano versions for him of them. So obviously Delius must have been paying him, so he was reasonably well off as an artist in Paris. That was a great advantage for him, that other people would come to him probably to borrow money as much as anything else, but it meant he got to know a very wide circle. As far as we know, he never had much to do with Debussy, who lived on the other side of Paris. Delius was based in sort of Montparnasse area, which was the general area where the artists used to congregate. But he also knew composers which are less known to us. He knew Fauré very well. He's quite a well-known composer, but not many people know about Florence Schmidt, who was quite a considerable artist, really, but never quite reached the audience that the others did. But he never knew that many French composers. He didn't seem to be too interested, really. Although he took from them, he was very interested only in his producing work in his own way. So he never struggled to reach a lot of composers, more interested in the artists, the painters, really.
And then he encountered another very well-known painter.
Oh, well, yes, Edvard Munch we're talking about. You can see immediately the relationship between the two men there, because they're both bohemian, although they were very formal in the sense of the way they dressed and so on. They looked like middle-class bankers, really, but they were far from that, of course.
And so we explore Delius's friendship through a meeting in this next chapter. In a Paris restaurant, he meets his friend, the artist Edvard Munch.
In the Closerie des Lilas, a popular estaminet for artists and students in the Boulevard de Montparnasse, in full view of Port Royal, Fritz sits smiling at his melancholy friend, Edvard Munch, who is so notorious for his expressionist paintings of bourgeois decadence.
You dress even more smartly than I do. Wolves in sheep's clothing. Disguised like bankers, one would never guess we're the worst kind of bohemians.
Society is morally corrupt, and we can't help but it be infected too. My inherited burden is that my families were lawyers and doctors, narrow-minded and faithful Norwegians. I'm successful as a painter in Germany because I insult the Puritan conscience. The truth is, among my own people, I live a dangerous exile on a tiny island.
Ah, yes. I can see in your work that there isn't much you hide about the ravages of shame and guilt. But I simply shut off my past from the present, thank God. Unlike you, I was never the sort to be haunted by a troubled conscience. Munch leans back to spy me through a smoke ring.
No, like Gauguin, you allow exotic ideas to tease the imagination away from the grossness, but the darkness hangs there all the same.
You're an odd fellow. You avoid the sort of sentimentality that pleases the mob, but enjoy the notoriety of having your pictures banned for their challenge to bourgeois lies.
Munch holds his coffee cup at an angle, so it blocks an uneasy reflection of himself in a mirror.
Dear Munch, I'm afraid those starving visions of hell in your work are not for me, or not even the dying paradise in Gauguin's. In some ways, the enjoyment of the moment, the thing that has made me, is my way of avoiding such painful truths. By this time, Munch, he was older, about 10 years older, I think, than Delius, and he'd become very criticised in his own country, Norway, and in fact, was best out of the country, and so he held his exhibitions at this time in Paris when he could, because the French were interested in it, or Germany. His art became very popular in Germany at the time, and of course, they're all anti-establishment, as we might say, pictures. And his form of art was not impressionist art, it was expressionist art, where the colours start to flow on the canvas and it's states of anxiety that are being expressed, whereas in impressionism it's always lovely and peaceful and so on, charming and pastoral. It's quite a different style, and that was something also that interested Delius, this deeper way of seeing the human personality. I mean, in his some of his operas, particularly his later operas, like Fenby and Grez, he is exploring an expressionist viewpoint of relationship. It's not the romantic view of relationship at all. The romantic view of relationship is breaking down in Delius's later operas, because fairy tale interested him enormously when he was young. But realism creeps more and more into his art as he gets older. Even the form of his work changes, like he gets interested in the sonata form and concerto form later in life, less interested in that form when he's younger. It's as if he's gathering himself together and being more specific in his purpose.
And it is through Delius's relationships with artists that he meets perhaps the most important figure in his life, who is Jelka.
Taking a boat from the far side of the bridge at Grez-sur-Loire and following my new friend, Jelka Rosen's breathless instructions, we row from the village into the flooded orchard of one of the dwellings above the bank, where she guides me into a riverside garden. We tie up to a protruding branch, then, shoes in hand, wade up to the house above us, taken as a summer studio. Ida, Jelka's artist companion, and Marcel, an artist model, run down from an easel on the terrace to greet us. Then, once we dry out and become presentable, Jelka proudly shows me her fellow student's canvas that Ida Gerhardi is too shy to comment on herself. Marcel stands before it too, flattered to see an image of herself being worshipped through a handsome stranger's eyes.
The girls run to and fro for cakes that they've prepared. When Jelka re-enters the garden, she finds him earnestly studying her painting.
Such attention. Your mind seems full of it, Fritz. Much more than I dare to think.
You have a generous and bountiful view of life, though of course it is far too early in our relationship for me to make risky critical comments on your work. After that, I sit down and take the glass of wine that the ladies offer me. What fun! I make a provocative comment to Marcel and tease her by stealing the last cake. Finally, the greedy me lifts Jelka's unfinished canvas and places it on an easel in a new position where I can purposely take a second view. Immediately, she grabs up her palette and pulls a face.
Don't pretend. You think Ida's work is better, don't you?
You've now introduced Jelka, the most important woman in Delius's life, probably. Could you tell us something about how they met and how important she was to him?
Well, I think they must have first seen each other in Paris because she was an art student, the Académie Closerie, I think it was, and he, it so happened, was often across the street in a sort of coffee shop, a cremerie, and he must have noticed her and picked her out, probably, and she may have noticed him. And it so happened that they had a mutual friend who invited the two of them, not as a couple, of course, because they weren't, but separately, to some sort of evening she was having. And he was invited to bring his songs along, because he'd published a few songs by this time, about all he had published at this moment. And so he did. And it so happened that Jelka was there and was a singer, or an amateur singer. And he obviously was drawn to her, because the voice expresses a great deal about character. And it seemed they got on very well after that. And they also had things in common. I mean, her father was an ambassador, was in the diplomatic service in Germany, and I think at one time had been German ambassador in Bulgaria or somewhere like that. And so she was a very well-educated woman. She was absolutely fascinated by art herself and was ready to discuss it with a drop of a coin, as it were. So that's what happened. They got together.
Delius's relationship with Jelka was complicated, many of the details kept between themselves. However, the next two chapters, I think, illustrate some of the elements of their relationship.
After a short second trip to America on a recital tour with his friend Halfdan Jeber, and accompanied by Fritz's current mistress, the Princess de Sistria, as his singer, Delius has made up his mind to change his life and return to Paris. When in June 1897 he finally arrives at Grez, Fritz cannot help posturing, as if uncomfortable about finding himself more dependent on Jelka. Each movement is part of a predetermined act of self-conscious surrender, or that's how he intends his decision to seem.
As I light my cigar, place my hat on one side of my head, embarrassment comes close to impertinence.
There's no need to act like this. Why are you trying to be someone else? I know who you are, Fritz, and you mustn't change.
He moves into the shadow.
You're right. Your trust is wonderful. You make me ashamed of my own shallowness. That's why I need to see more of you. You're the cure for my foolishness and a way to find peace and quiet. You see, I'm too frightened of slipping back into my old way of life and somehow betraying myself.
Jelka makes him sit down and draws up a chair to face him.
You know, I was waiting outside the porte cochere when you arrived. In a way, I was on guard to make sure you couldn't surprise me by appearing unexpectedly.
So I am an unwelcome visitor after all.
For the other girls, it was easy. They thought it would be a simple matter of turning you away with cold politeness by trumpeting the assurance that the plans for our own school of women painters were more important.
Delius gets up and looks out bleakly into the garden.
I can't blame you. I haven't been able to break away from my own wayward influences. It was confusing. At first, I thought it was better to be on my own, to expose myself to different ways of life. But now, I know my only safeguard is companionship, to have an understanding woman beside me, to stay with you whenever I wish. Jelka and Ida inspire Fritz with a new composition.
Soon, Fritz moves in with Jelka, but still retains his rooms in Paris. One day at Grez, as Jelka reads the work of Nietzsche that she and Delius both enjoyed, Jelka has a bright idea. With their infectious enthusiasm, she and Ida decide on a ruse to produce a poem written in English to flatter him. This was difficult, as their common language was usually German or a stilted French. Later, in the twilight, holding candles, Jelka and Ida spy on Fritz as he glances at the scrabbled paper on his desk. The fear is that he might push it aside like a bill or a receipt, but he leans back, twists an end of his moustache, and studies it more thoroughly.
I get up with it, and after pacing the room, wander into the garden, now sombre with shadow.
Can our trick work? Indifference or laughter is more likely.
So it's your work, is it?
They draw closer to him.
Hold the lights higher. It's true, it suggests a conspiracy, yet I'm sure I've read a version of this somewhere else.
Read it to us then. We must hear it in your own voice to know if it is right.
It's perfectly right. So much so that I want to set it to music, not your version, but in the original.
Fritz takes one of their candles, passes to the bottom of the garden, then turns his back to shield the flame, which makes it harder for them to find him. Once he senses their pursuit, close to the river, he declaims the words of Zarathustra's night song.
What must those who witness the light endure? Now, out of me, as the source of a spring, bursts the desire for belonging. Night it is when all things are at one, when the sighs of lovers are heard, and my soul too is the song of those who seek the wholeness, the oneness of each in another.
So what do we know about Delius's clandestine love affairs?
Not a lot, because although we know he had them, after he died, his wife went through the letters and certainly burnt the more personal ones. It wasn't just because she was frightened his reputation might be marred. I think it was also because she felt she didn't want their personal life to be explored too deeply, because he'd become a famous man. So obviously she did have the right to censor it, I suppose.
Yeah.
But one we do know about is this relationship with the Princess de Sistria.
She was a singer.
It was a long-term sort of relationship, really. I suppose that's what annoyed Jelka even more, really. About his other casual relationships, we know very little.
But speaking of Delius' letters, what some people might not know is that Delius kept a pet jackdaw. One day, he adopts this bird, which in the end creates more problems than it solves.
2 years pass. Apart from Delius's fits of annoyance, Coanga, his pet jackdaw, has developed a strange habit of sorting out the mail. It lifts out the perfumed letters from the others, as if it has craftily spied the master has other preoccupations besides his music and business affairs. Jelka watches the bird, anxious that the creature has a sympathy with Delius and was sharing secrets not privy to herself.
I know everything you don't, lady.
Is it her own desperation? Now she is left more alone. She finds herself following Coanga around, and every time it caws, cocks its head or jumps, she translates its scuffles into the worst sort of human slyness.
Is it true what they say of ravens and jackdaws, that they are ominous and prophetic?
Eventually, she is driven to discuss her fears about Delius's other love affairs with Ida.
Fred's coldness frightens me, and sometimes I miss the company of our old friends, the girls at the academy.
But outside of his personal life, Fritz's professional career begins to take off as he prepares to arrive at his first concert in England.
In 1899, to prepare for my first concert in England, I dropped my first name for Jelka's more familiar one of Fred, and have more than enough to do. Alfred Hertz, the conductor, appreciates my presence at rehearsals for the concert, but in the choral sequences from my opera Coanga, the result is cacophony. At the point when banjos sound, the wags in the chorus regard it as fair game to parody my unique concept of an African-American opera.
Claire, his sister, who was in Bradford, wrote,
The breakfast went on. My father at one end of the table, my mother at the other. The papers rustled. Nothing was to be learned from my father's face. He appeared just as usual,
In his customary manner, he gutted the papers and then laid them neatly aside. For some minutes, he gave his attention solely to the food in front of him. Then he remarked, casually, like one mentioning a trifle of no account, "I see Fritz has given a concert."
Delius's career then goes from strength to strength as he travels Europe, attending various performances of his work. Significantly, in Germany, Fritz hears his tone poem Paris for the first time.
At Elberfeld in 1901, Jelka hears my tone poem Paris, where it is perfectly clear what I am writing about. In the concert hall, Jelka and myself link hands and rise to signal our triumph to Ida.
Ida has her own interests, not only with the romance of the music, but with the pride she kept to herself at helping Delius so much through her contacts in Germany that encouraged the performances of his work. Jelka remembers what he wrote at the head of the score.
Mysterious city, city of pleasures, of gay music and dancing, of painted and beautiful women, wondrous city, unveiling but to those who shunning day live through the night and return home to the sound of awakening streets and the rising dawn.
Paris is a glorious rhapsody expressing the fundamental dance of life. It seizes the magic of nights when a girl might dance to the heartbeat of a great city.
In her own reflective moment, Jelka saw Fritz at the heart of it, walking towards her.
Just as I did once before, down the Avenue du Maine where I once had my studio. An old grey hat, his blue, vivacious eyes, pale face and red tie, accentuating the pallor and the flaps of the Macfarlane he used to throw back over his shoulders, so the joy is made perfect.
The city is made to echo what she felt, as Fritz proved its hero. Now, sure of his public success, Jelka and Fritz are married in 1903. So what's the significance of Delius's opera, A Village Romeo and Juliet?
Well, this is often considered his most important opera. I think it's because it's about youth and innocence. I think that interested him. And the novel is a bit tedious, really, rather formal. But he obviously saw in it an anti-establishment story, because in the opera, the Romeo and Juliet, they end up drowning themselves.
It was based on a true story, wasn't it?
It's supposed to be, yes, in a newspaper article about two teenagers who ran away together and then were found dead because they couldn't face the adult world. And also the parents in the opera are always going at each other's throats. You know, the two families, that's where it relates to Romeo and Juliet, of course. And I think this must have struck a chord with him. And he gets very poetic about it in the opera. He has a character called the Dark Fiddler, who in some sense represents fate. He's drawing them on and on. The music is luring them towards destruction ultimately, because any other way of fulfillment is not open to them. There's no chance of their being accepted or reaching fulfillment in the kind of society they find themselves in.
What happened to Delius during the First World War? What was he doing at that time?
Well, he had to leave France, of course, and he came to England and lived in England for 2 or 3 years. And I think it opened his eyes when he came to England again. He never thought of himself much as an English composer, because he'd sort of more like an exiled composer, really. But now he had to think differently. I mean, it was Beecham was helping him an awful lot. He came into contact with all sorts of new composers, new people, like Philip Heseltine. Yes, he did know Heseltine before the war, but now, of course, there was a longer relationship with Heseltine. And his music begins to change, partly due to the artists that he met in England, particularly the Harrison sisters. Like Beatrice Harrison was a famous cellist of the time. And he wrote a concerto for her and a sonata for Beatrice. He got on wonderfully with the Harrison family. You know, they were all girls and all the rest of it and so on. He liked being among women. He needed to get on very well that way. I'm not sure he got on so well always among men because he's had such a strong personality. But he found it uplifting, the sort of conversation and the brilliance of their playing. Remember, at this time, illness was beginning to affect him quite severely, and the beginning of his handicap was occurring. But then he came away, I think, reasonably confident from England, and he had a chalet built in Norway, because that was his favourite place, really, place among the mountains. He loved the mountains, you know. This was a place of refuge, I think, a place where he could feel his own spirit, which was a kind of solitary spirit, really. He could fulfill himself, found it very creative.
But he wasn't always solitary in Norway. This next chapter tells of a time when the conductor, Thomas Beecham, who made friends with Delius, goes on a walking tour with him.
In 1908, Beecham, England's star conductor, to understand more of his favoured composer, agrees to accompany Delius on one of his walking tours in Norway.
I forge ahead through mountain pastures, and Beecham only catches up with me whenever I pause to admire a rockscape or newly blossoming flowers.
Oh, I tried to read Nietzsche's work, Beyond Good and Evil. My intention is to gain a fuller understanding of what you're saying in your music. The notes are fine, but I always wonder about the world behind it. Nothing we say can ever be expressed aright or interpreted correctly. But that's all right. It shows that music acts on a higher level than words.
We spend the next day fishing on the shores of Viksradnetne, a gem of blue water nestling like 1,000 others between the mountain slopes. The two of us determined to take a stand and camp there. Sheened by the passage of light, the pastures become fugitive under the march of night and steal away in shadow.
They made a hearty meal of fish and flatbread, but Beecham has misgivings. As he walks around, Beecham shivers and slaps his arms round himself, while Delius lies casually smoking. The young conductor looks restlessly at Delius. Later, Beecham murmurs in his sleep, "The men of the future are free spirits only because we make them so. Look into yourself. There's the truth." In after years, Beecham wrote about this time. "I had never known a keener and brighter spirit than Frederick. There was nothing in him of that vague indetermination associated traditionally with musical genius. In practical affairs, he was as hard-headed as any to be found in his native country. He knew exactly what he wanted and went after it with a simplicity and celerity that were models of direct action. Norway and the influence of the Norwegian way of life, simple and unspoilt by over-urbanization, cleansed his mind of the perilous stuff which had for too long been haunting it, and brought it back again into the enchanted world of folklore and fairyland."
He, of course, was a bachelor born in a sense, like artists often are, you know. They find relationships very difficult, artists generally, don't they? What happens is, of course, they're in love with their art.
And after years dealing with such issues, the strain on Fred and Jelka's relationship becomes more evident, as this next chapter indicates when Delius and Ida fall out over his love affairs.
At Grez, Delius sometimes shows a jealous, brutal aspect, which makes him snarl at Jelka, cuts her dead, and makes him brag about his own right to independence. He still relishes his promiscuity because he sees it as payback for the control of emotion required in his art. In a bitter argument concerning his continuing affair with the Princesse de Sistria, he uses his silence to delude her. But in the September richness, a shadow blocks his view.
Who is that in the garden?
As the back is turned to him, Delius doesn't recognize her. The hat is Jelka's, but when she notices him, he sees it is Ida who is wearing it. Delius approaches her casually.
Where has Jelka gone?
Ida leans back to show him the finished painting. It is of Jelka, but portrays a figure bent in grief. The face is hidden in her arms, and a torrent of hair flows over her shoulders. A tunnel of green behind her ends in the river.
What does that mean? It's different. You paint her like one of Munch's women, anxious and distraught.
Yes. I've tried to catch the figure behind the mask she wears.
Did she sit for it?
No. It's simply my own abstraction.
Does she like it?
Perhaps you should ask her yourself.
Will she tell me the truth?
Of course not.
Why not?
Can't you guess?
Because she's hiding a face she doesn't want you to see. The one which is there when you play on her innocence and convince her she's imagining things. The one when she looks up to you but doesn't want to face your lies.
Delius stretches an arm. With both hands he seizes the canvas from the easel and smashes it against the bark of a beech tree. Then picks up the broken frame that he flings out of sight among the shrubs. Ida gathers up her possessions, and Jelka, unable to say a word, observes her friend leave Grez for her studio in Montrouge.
I look into the transparency above the garden. I see through the world as much as I see through myself, and was to pay Jelka a heroic tribute for her sacrifice with my searching realist opera, Fenby and Gerda, but also more cheerfully with its opposite, a glorious tone poem, In a Summer Garden, which sings of the floral paradise she created to celebrate the costly triumph of our relationship. Partly because he was a very sensitive artist and was very close to nature and could convey not just a description of nature, but the spirit of nature, the way we feel when we're among woods or mountains, that sort of thing, or lonely moors. You know, somehow he would convey that inner sense, that soul-fulfilling sense that we get when we are alone with nature, rather like Wordsworth might have done in poetry. He had that tremendous gift. And also, we must think about the fact that he was such an individualist, a fearless man, I suppose, would take on any kind of experience, but always come out of it having learnt something stronger than when he'd gone into it, which I think is a lesson for us today, where we're surrounded by so many influences. We live in a kind of counterculture, don't we, where I think young people particularly don't know what to think or what way to turn. He just worked it out. You know, that's why he was a Nietzschean, you know, why he followed Nietzsche as a philosopher, because Nietzsche puts lots of emphasis on the will, the individual will, not the will to destroy, but the will to create and the will to believe, you know. That very much is a lesson that we could learn from, to be more independent and trust ourselves.
So I think a clear example of both Delius's love of nature and his willpower happened near the end of his life, when he started to become paralysed due to contracting syphilis and returned to his beloved home in Norway.
After the war, that I spent mostly in England, I grasped the rails of my veranda on my holiday chalet at Leipzig. There wasn't a ray of sunlight in that murky summer of 1923. My old friend, the pianist Percy Granger, was always full of jokes.
It doesn't matter that you're in a bath chair, Fred. We'll carry you up the mountain with you so you can talk to the clouds.
To the Norse gods, you mean? Preferably Odin and Thor. The visions and the memories we gain will pay us back for all the sacrifice and effort we suffer.
Percy slaps his knees. I love it. But what about Jelka? The mountain's a mile high. We have to cross snowfields to get there.
Rubbish. It's the middle of July. The meadows will be flowering below us. Jelka and Center will help us.
I'll make a litter out of straps and belts. We'll haul you up with the help of the villagers if necessary.
No, they won't carry me. They cross themselves at the sight of me. It's worse than at Grey. Some of them already look at their cows as if I've put a hex on them. The church reader, Ola Nordletten, told me my illness is divine punishment. But if they were truly spiritual, it should be uplifting for them to be part of our adventure.
Jelka and Center prepare the food and drink they need.
Each yard is an inspiration for me. I, like a Persian potentate in his litter, sit lifted on high, not in luxury, but to a welcome exposure of the elements flying in my face. The cloud and the rain blankets us. I shout fierce imprecations and urge on Ole and Percy, who are straining with the litter to make greater efforts. Why not, if the hopeful scheme is to bring rejuvenation, not to my limbs, which are useless, but definitely to mind and spirit. Delius as I knew him by Eric Fenby, who wrote his own account of his encounter with Delius and the years he spent working and living with him. And the reason why it's so thrilling, it is about his character as well. You can feel what Fenby is going through, and he doesn't tell us everything he's going through. I think he senses a great deal, and that interested me, that he was trying to not intrude too much in his description of Delius, but you can feel in the book the mental anguish he was going through, which is worth exploring in itself, you know. So that helped me with the last part of my book, you know. Obviously I closely followed this, but I had to express everything in my own personal way.
So, this next chapter, inspired by Fenby's book, illustrates some of the elements of their relationship. In his final years, the young musician Eric Fenby comes to help him at Grey.
Blind and paralysed, I am dependent on a young amanuensis, Eric Fenby, who comes from Yorkshire, to write and revise the last of my music. Our relationship begins as a soul-destroying battle until the two of us, young and old, gain a consensus, though this time it's Fenby who bears the burden.
This opening, Delius, to your tone poem, A Song of Life and Love, you repeat the same phrase 3 or 4 times. Do you really mean it? If you've got anything to say, you should get going more quickly, in my view. After all, what is it anyway? Just a recurring arpeggio? I, Fenby, who tolerates more than I should, under this man whose music I love, clank it out on the piano.
And I, Frederick Delius, brought back to life with Eric under my command, am electric with attention.
And all this muttering in the basses, so expectant as if something important is about to happen. You've given the audience a prophecy, an expectation, you know, like Strauss does in Also sprach Zarathustra. But listen, this is what actually happens.
Again, the piano bangs out, but this time in an unending series of staccato chords, mechanically repeated on the same notes. You've played it through twice, and I have your opinion. Now I order you to destroy it.
Not possible, Delius. There's too much in it that's good. See how that little theme becomes a plaintive melody that hits the ear. It draws the mind into memory and heartbreak. Oh no, Delius, I forbid you to sacrifice it. Delius smiles grimly as I continued to play. There's a weak bit here, but lovely all the same. It just lacks confidence, Delius. Your illness. Don't let it beat you. This part's marvelous, where you gather your forces, truly heroic. And the merriment. We're in Paris, aren't we? But seen a long way off. The dancing girls are not so young as they used to be, are they?
Yes, the clouds get in the way. Half of it's meandering rubbish.
Oh, we can definitely do things with this dreamy tune. The mood is just right. Knock it into shape in its perfect Delius.
Except that it's entirely wrong, of course, and needs to be remade.
Maybe. If only you didn't leave in all these throbbing repeated chords.
I laugh, and Eric taps my arm.
Never mind. I'll always rescue you from predictability.
Sadly, Delius's illness progressed, and eventually he became entirely bedbound, as we see in this final chapter.
Fortunately, they often have visits from old friends.
Of course, the part you're playing is no small one, Eric.
This announcement was made by Fred's fellow composer and patron, Balfour Gardner.
If you go to pieces, all is lost. I'm sorry, I can only spend a couple of days here. What can I say? Count me as your truest friend, because with the rest of the world I can see the huge importance of your being here.
Most of the time I'm doing nothing here, except patiently waiting for him to gain strength so that he can control my talents in his own way.
Jelka will return from her treatment soon enough. He still lives because of you, and it's also you who connects the two of them.
I'm tired to death.
Don't worry, lad. I'll see you're up to it. I'll keep writing to you, and so will Beecham. You're not alone, you know. Remember, it's now Jelka who needs you most of all.
I cycled back to Grez from the sanatorium where Jelka was receiving treatment.
That's it, Eric. Tell me more. I can picture her. Take extra flowers. Let her know that the garden is thinking about her. We'll soon be back at work again, lad.
The rally is short-lived. Delius sinks back into discomfort and sleeplessness. Delius is slipping into the shadows, but it is I, Fenby, who takes the plunge and throws himself into the waters to rescue Delius so that he can live and compose once more. Delius! Delius! Time ticks on, and the July sun, shut out of the room, keeps pity to itself. In fear, I withdraw and sleep until awakened by the maid.
Monsieur, he's moving again.
I pass into Mrs. Delius's room where she is resting. The look on her face surprises me as she realizes the truth already.
My dear, be brave. Delius is dead.
After breakfast, I sent telegrams to Beecham and Balfour Gardner, and then, with Mrs. Delius and Brooks, debated the subject of his burial. So Delius achieved a great deal as a man and as a composer. What would you say is his overall legacy and importance to us today?
I would say he could convey the spirit of nature, the fact that he was such an individualist, but his music seems to transmit that confidence and the beauty, of course. And beauty, don't forget, is a reflection of truth in absolute terms. And that's how I think he saw beauty. He saw beauty as actually speaking about strength and virtue and the things that make us what we are. He wasn't a religious man in the orthodox sense, but he certainly has a sense of religion in his poetry, in his music. There's no question about that.
Alan, thank you so much for speaking to us about your novel, Sea Drift, A Life of Frederick Delius, which is the first fictionalized account in the form of a novel of the life of this extraordinary composer. Thank you for speaking to us today.